I was a passenger with an app driver, and something wasn't right. It was late enough that the city had stopped trying to look presentable. Streetlights pooled in tired yellow ovals. A light rain mapped the windshield in a pattern that made the whole world look like a smear in someone's palm. I had just come off a 12-hour shift in a place that teaches you to read the diffuse signs of damage, the tiny ridges where tissue separates, the way a bruise will bloom clockwise, and I wanted nothing more than to sit and let the car move without me needing to notice anything at all. I ordered the ride with a thumb and a half-hearted lie. On my way home, the app chirped, a small civic promise that someone would appear and take me where maps insisted I belonged. He arrived in a third-generation sedan that looked like it had been scrubbed of personality. The driver was a man in his 40s maybe, with the sort of hands that read as honest. Calloused fingertips, half-peeled cuticles. They sat on the wheel as if they belonged there, as if they had always been tasked to keep other people moving. He had a plain face that showed neither threat nor warmth, an ordinary mask for ordinary hours, the kind of face you forget within an hour. I climbed in. The interior smelled like disinfectant and old fabric, but beneath that, something else knifed through, the faint, waxy sweetness of something burned and then preserved. It was subtle at first, the way a memory is subtle, but it quickened my attention like a pulse tracer finding a distant heartbeat. The trunk had a hum to it. Not metaphorically, it vibrated through the seat and under my soles, a low, regular frequency, more mechanical than organic, but insistently present. A hum that suggested something being kept cold, or alive, or at the very least, not meant to sit quiet. "Where to?" the driver asked without looking up from the windshield. His voice was low and plain, the neutral register people use when they're trying to be unremarkable. "North of the river," I said. "Back to Grove and 8th. He nodded and set off. The map on my phone did its quiet recalculations, blue pulsing along roads I knew. He didn't put his GPS on. He didn't need it. He had a small folded clipboard tucked into the crook between the passenger seat and center console. A rubber band held it closed. A typed strip peeked from beneath the band, the kind of heavy bureaucratic font you see on internal memos. No logo, no sender, just a tidy block of numbers and the words, "Delivery, no questions." There are professions that condition you to notice things people call nothing. A radiologist reads the margin of a shadow and turns it into hypothesis. Someone who has assisted autopsies will tell you what a stage of decomposition looks like in the light of an operating lamp. I have a little of that habit, not because I'm proud of it. Habits, like infections, are rarely earned. They simply take hold. So I began cataloging the car.
The rear-view mirror bore a faint scrape near its mount, as if something with claws had once found purchase and been denied. A pair of latex gloves lay balled in the glove compartment, dusting themselves with road grit. There was a roll of packing tape tucked beneath the passenger side floor mat. The upholstery had a patch on the back seat where something had been bolted down in haste, a set of bolt holes, darkened at the edges, like the around of secret eyes. There was a strap beneath a folded tarp, and, if you looked at the base of the cargo cover, a smear of something that wasn't just road dirt. Wax, scabbed and flaked, pale and brittle, the color of old beeswax. He kept his hands on the wheel the way a surgeon keeps his hands on his patient, steady, preparing for an incision he might not make. "Long night?" he asked, and I could have lied, but I said the truth in the kind of trimmed sentence medical training produces. "Longer than it should be," I said. "You're a long-haul driver?" He glanced at me finally, as if considering what to reveal. "Part-time," he said. "Mostly deliveries at night. Less traffic, less notice." He didn't smile when he said less notice. He said it as a fact. He said it as an efficiency. A soft CTA lodged between the gears of the moment, like a polite cough. If you like late-night rides like this, if the thin hours of city liminality pull at you, hit subscribe. But the car had a sound more interesting than my social media economy to consider. We moved. The hum in the trunk continued, a steady thrum like an engine with a secret, and I found that I couldn't let it go. I listened to the way it interacted with the heartbeat in my throat. Sometimes it synchronized, a beat-for-beat echo, which made the seat seem to have two hearts. We left the well-lit arteries of the city and eased into a region where sodium lamps were fewer and the roads spilled out into gravel. He took a route that avoided main roads, a series of crooked avenues and service roads whose presence on a GPS depends on whether they've been declared useful. The app's map traced our path in bright certainty. The driver made softer decisions. "You're not using GPS," I observed. "I know the way," he said. "Their maps changed a bunch." He took corners with a rhythm I couldn't parse, too cautious to be indifferent, too smooth to be improvising. I kept cataloging. Good to assign work to the hands when the head wants to chatter. It kept fear from stuffing my mouth. The clipboard shifted against the seat, the rubber band creaking. He fidgeted once, and I noticed for the first time the small printed tag clipped to the corner, white cardstock, punched with a hole, a number stamped in red. Specimen, 9. The number read like a docket. He caught my eyes in the rear view. For a moment, less than a heartbeat, his face rearranged into something like relief. People always relax around those who notice what they conceal. It's the oldest trick. Or maybe it was recognition.
Maybe he had been a courier before he was bored into being a man who did deliveries, and that number was a familiar numeral that lived in his hands at night. "You can't open the crate," he said, suddenly. His voice was low and plain again, but the plainness had teeth. "Why not?" I asked, in the only voice that is ever louder than curiosity, the voice that knows when not to ask. He shrugged. "Orders." Orders is a lovely word for what people hide behind. It is both dissertation and scab. It is the thing institutions use to make the impossible ordinary. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. The car's speakers were tuned to an unfussy FM station that played a song in which the chorus died and then restarted, as if trying to remember how to be sad. It was rhythmically useful. It filled the space between our breaths with something polite and human. The hum under me persisted. I shifted and a gap appeared at the base of the center console, small enough to slip a smartphone camera into if one were so inclined. People invent rationales for intrusions, an app that tracks a strange route, a friend who insists on proof. I told myself I was taking the evidence-gathering kit with me in my head. I fumbled the phone like someone removing a scalpel from a drawer. The camera caught little, plastic trim, a bent staple, the tarpaulin edge, but then, through a thin slit where the boot cover met the seat, I saw it, a corner of paper tied to something under the tarp, a stubby metal tag like the kind you screw into crates, and the faint suggestion of feather. Not full feathers, too coarse for that. Metallic shards, almost like the edge of a lamellar scale, clinging to the canvas. The light caught it in a way that made it glint like a fishbone. I swallowed. I am sometimes arrogant enough to think that seeing is a form of mastery, and so I leaned further to see better. "Don't," he said, crisp as a snapped twig. "Close that." I sat up. My palms were damp. "Sorry," I said. "Just curiosity." He made a sound that might have been humor. "Curiosity gets people a lot of places," he said, "and people a lot of trouble. Both in one night." He glanced at the road and his knuckles whitened. In his hands was a paper receipt, a list of coordinates and times, and a single line of text that read like a minimized command. "Room 9, confirm." The words had been typed on a cheap thermal printer, the kind you find in back rooms where paper specialists are paid not to ask questions. Room 9. An odd name. Innocuous enough if you mean a hospital wing, less innocuous if you mean a facility that labels itself by room and number and never advertises. When I asked about it, he said only, "We get a list, we move the crate, we don't interact, we don't get involved." That was as much as I got. The car took a turn and the streetlight shelved us in a pool of indifferent amber. For a moment, I thought about the logical, small horrors I could enumerate if I wanted to make sense of this. Contraband, precious artifacts, a husband's hidden guitar. All smaller explanations than what the glint of metal implied, all human-scaled. My mind preferred large answers, as if scale lends honesty. There was an envelope on the dashboard, typed with a single line. Fragile, handle with care. A rubber stamp left a bluish crescent, as if an official had pressed a tired seal too hard. I reached for it and touched the crescent, and the wax left a faint smear on my fingertip. It was not the color of sealing wax, but of candle ledge after a long vigil. Dried, waxy residue the color of skin under heat. I tucked that smear into my memory, where I keep things that may save me or damn me later. He drove through a county that the app faded over, the kind of jurisdiction maps agree to ignore. The city's edge is always worse at night. It reveals the private economies of light and dark. The hum in the trunk changed pitch, as if whatever was inside the crate shifted its position or remaindered small mechanical breaths. It made me think of a chest that will not sit still on the table, the way a living thing is misbehaving inside clothing sewn to restrain it. Anatomy metaphors are a cheap defense. They keep the imagination pinned to what we understand. A rib cage wrapped in canvas, a spinal column that wants to steer. He took another turn, this one into a private road lined by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire.
A gate stood ajar, propped by a battered cinder block. Someone had slid a typed instruction through the slot: deliver after hours. The kind of instruction that implies a convenience for those who keep secrets. Do you ever think about what you're moving? I asked, and I knew I shouldn't have been asking. Questions in closed cars are like barbed wire. They sometimes catch flesh. He hesitated only a fraction before answering. You do your job, he said. Not everyone gets to pick their cargo. There was a habitual normalization in his voice, like someone who has rinsed their hands of things they don't want to notice. It was the voice of the person who signs for parcels and then goes home. But there was also a tempo of old, bone-deep shame in it, as if certain memories had been arranged into a nightly rota. I thought about the times I'd watched other people's lives reduced to crate sizes. The museum consignments, the clinical specimens wrapped and labeled by hands that thought of nothing else. My own fingers remembered slip-slid gloves and a cold table. I felt the old compulsion to record. I felt the itch to know. What's in there? I asked. He kept his gaze on the road. Depends on who asked me to move it. There is a kind of answer that is the absence of answer. In a court of law, it's called evasiveness. In human relationships, it's called preservation. He flicked his indicator, and the car slowed.
The fence opened into a lot that smelled of oil and old rain. There were low warehouse buildings, their windows like dead teeth. Old signage smiled and peeled. 2 of the buildings had canted letters that spelled nothing. The gravel gritted under the tires, and the hum behind me sharpened into a cadence I could feel in my molars. We stopped. He killed the engine. The hum paused, and we sat in a vacuum of small sounds, the rain angling, the street lamp drowning, his breath measured. For a second, the car rearranged itself into a tiny geology, like a cave that had kept one secret too long. He reached for the clipboard and unfolded it. The rubber band slid away like a small concession. A piece of paper was clipped to the corner, the same thermal printout, coordinates, time, and the single word, confirm. Beneath it, a line in a different font, pencil-smudged and angry, don't bring no one. He touched the pencil line with a fingertip, and then, with a quick, efficient motion, slid a folded envelope from beneath the pad and pressed it into my hand as if it were nothing, a delivery receipt, damp at one corner. It bore a signature I didn't recognize and a stamped hour. My name was not on it. It was the world's quietest extortion, a piece of paper handed over in the rain that had no business being ours. Why did you give me that? I asked. The question was uselessly polite. I had picked it up like a coin to study it. So you remember, he said. So if something happens, you can say you were just a passenger. A lot of people carry such absolutions, a phone app that logs their journey, a receipt. The app is the world's least poetic alibi, but this was different. This had an edge. He handed me another thing, palm down and small, a tag clipped to a brass ring. On it, in the same red type, Specimen 9. There was an additional tiny hand scratch in pen, RN. Not the initials of a nurse, I thought, but something else, or someone else. He didn't look at me when he spoke next. You want to get out? He asked. Silence is often judged by how well it can be filled. I thought of getting out into the rain. I thought of stepping away and leaving whatever was in that crate to whatever twilight ethics kept it there. I imagined myself as an honest man of no business who had seen something and told someone about it. I imagined the phrase, I didn't see anything, on my lips, and how easily it would sit. I'd like to know what room 9 is, I said instead, because curiosity morphs into courage at odd times. He let a long breath out through his teeth. Room 9's a place that gets things no one else wants, he said. They have benefactors. They get the proper invoices. We just move the things. We don't decide. His voice was steady, like someone reading from a manual. Benefactors. The word sat in the car like a coin on the floor, and I couldn't tell if it was hot or cold. You ever think about doing something else? I asked.
It was maybe the least useful question of all, like wondering whether a river will stop flowing. He looked at me then with a new angle, as if the old surface of his face had been sanded and revealed the grain beneath. We don't get paid to think, he said. We get paid to move things. There were small domestic items in the back of the car now that I hadn't noticed before. An empty thermos, a paperback whose spine had been folded into a particular passage, and a child's plastic dinosaur with its limb neatly cut off and sanded. Someone's keepsake, perhaps. Those little human things spoke of other lives folded into courier routes, people who carry the remnants of their days as ballast against the night. He stood and opened the trunk. You can watch someone else do anything and still be entirely removed from the event. Horror in movies always betrays itself by insisting that the protagonist will run into a room and look inside. In real life, a person will often hesitate. You discover that restraint has weight. It is the shape of decisions not yet made. When he opened the trunk, the smell hit me whole. It was the wax again, but layered within it a sterile tang that tasted like a hospital corridor at dawn. There was a canvas-covered crate, strapping across it, metal bands cinched tight, and a sticker in the center, "Handle with care, Specimen 9." The tarp had been tucked around the edges in a way that suggested it had been done by someone who didn't want anything to rattle loose, tight folds, meticulous. He didn't pull the tarp back. He only unbuckled a strap high enough for me to view the gap, and through that gap I saw something that belonged to an anatomy I did not know the language for. I saw a suggestion of feathers, but wrong, too stiff, too metallic at the edges, as if a bird had fused with machine. A fragment of something that might have been skin, but with the sheen of enamel. A dull, circular pad of what might have been cartilage. I did not see eyes. I did not see a mouth. I saw only an arrangement of surfaces that implied the organization of a living thing, without giving me the mercy of recognition. There was a small tag tied to the canvas, a handwritten note that had the slant of someone who writes quickly, "Do not open if unauthorized." The air around the crate had the sound of a held breath. The hum sharpened into a staccato I could feel. He looked at me without accusation and said, "Don't touch anything." I didn't want to touch anything. The impulse to touch, always there, is the same impulse that makes people press their faces to glass and imagine other lives. I didn't want to be the person who thought their curiosity was an excuse for touch. I wanted to be someone who could walk away and say nothing at all. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. He shrugged, which was as good an answer as any. "Maybe because you looked, maybe because tonight I wanted to dump the feeling, maybe because moving it feels different with a witness."
He secured the strap. The buckle made a metallic, decisive click, and the hum damped like an engine settling. I had a pocket full of rationalizations. I had a brain that liked to name everything. Artifact, specimen, contraband, recruit. I had a history that put me in the position of noticing, but none of those things explained why, when he closed the trunk, I felt like someone had pressed a cold palm against the back of my neck. We drove again. The road unrolled and measured darkness. The gate we had passed through slid shut behind us with a hollow thud, like a throat swallowing. The app lit my phone with the route back to my address, but the driver didn't take it. He took another road, a skinny, unpainted lane that ran along an old drainage canal. Streetlights thinned until the sky was a bright bruise. "Why the detour?" I asked. My voice made room for the question as if it were a fragile animal. "There's a faster way," he said. "The app doesn't like it." Some things you accept because you've accepted them before. The car's hum resumed its soft, low favor, as if placated. The thing in the trunk settled into a rhythm with the road, and I found myself counting until the beats matched my pulse, and then diverged, and then matched again. I am, in moments like that, petty and proud. I catalogued where the hum changed in pitch with each change in speed, and with the degree of care in the road surface. I could have made a small chart then and there. I could have become the kind of person who maps the signature of a crate like a cardiac tracing. "Who are the benefactors?" I asked finally. The word suddenly mattered, as if it would have weight only when named. He sighed. It was a human sound after all that machinery, weathered and small. "People who want things kept the right way," he said. "Not show off, not in a museum, not public, private hands." He tapped the steering wheel with a single finger in a rhythm that matched a line of something written in the margins of my training notes. "Secrecy shapes what we do." "They pay well." Money explains a lot, and it explains nothing. It is the simplest vector people point to when they prefer to avoid lucidity. We took a narrow bridge, one of those low structures that belch damp air up through the car's floorboards. Under the bridge was the canal, black and patient, and on the far side an expanse of industrial roofs, and one building that had the kind of facade meant to repel attention.
A light blinked in a second-floor window like a lighthouse for people who don't want being found. He slowed. For the first time, his lips moved in a way that suggested he was about to say more, and then closed. The typical professional compulsion returned to study my face, as if I were an object under a lamp. "Look," he said finally. "You asked. You saw. I'm telling you because you'll ask someone. And people who get curious get themselves into a certain shape, uncomfortable."
Better you have this and can say you were just a passenger. He gave that small, half-explanatory laugh that people use when they want their complicity to be plausible. I slid the specimen tag out of my palm. The red type printed specimen-9 was as stark as a surgical mark. There was another inked line on the reverse, an initial that might have been M, a shorthand signature, the sort of thing you put on work you don't plan to own. "Do you ever feel guilty?" I asked. The moral question we ask strangers because acquaintances we ask rarely. He looked at me hard then, and for a bare moment I saw an unarmored person, someone who perhaps moved things because they had bills, someone who had a family and a mortgage, someone whose conscience had the texture of old elastic. "Guilt's expensive," he said. "I don't have it in my wallet." We arrived at a bifurcation, a choice point in the road where one route returned to the city and the other continued into obscurity. The lane on the left was wider, well lit, populated. The lane on the right dwindled between warehouses and then vanished into a line of trees. He turned right. "You're not taking me home," I said then, and it was less a question than an observation. He didn't laugh. He didn't offer a lie. He only said, "Not yet." If your life were a ledger of small choices, this would be the line where a debit entered. The rain had come back harder, small bullets against the glass. The hum had found a new pitch, something keening at the edges like metallic wings seeking purchase. The canvas strap rubbed against the buckle with a sound that vibrated up through the seat into my spine. "Do you ever—" I hesitated, the question itself a kind of needle. "Do you ever wonder what happens to the things you move?" He stared at the road like a person who was tallying columns in his head. "I know enough to keep moving," he said. "Less you see, less you need to be." I had been taught to believe that knowledge obliges action. That is a moral edict dressed up in professional jargon. My own hands remembered other obligations, to record, to file, to report. But the world does not present itself in the ethical register I prefer. It gives safety, it gives danger, it gives the small, sly envelopes that people slide you when they want you to remember a time. At a bend, a small thing rolled across the floorboard, a metal feather, half the size of a bookmark, dull and notched along one edge. It had the feel of something that was part jewelry, part mechanical. It clinked against the central console and then stopped, as if deciding not to be noticed. He noticed it too, but his hands did not reach for it. He only said, "Pocket that," and when I hesitated, he jabbed a thumb at it with a decisive, businesslike motion. I closed my hand around it and felt its cool weight. The metal left a faint residue in my palm, like the sweat of a stranger. The narrow lane ended at a low-rise compound surrounded by weathered fencing.
Lights painted a corridor of pale amber across the gravel. A man in a jacket stood by a gate and raised a clipboard when we arrived, as if awaiting the precise ritual of arrival. Two others stood in the shadows like statues that had been asked to stand still. The driver presented his pad. The man at the gate looked at it, and then at the truck, and then at the thermal printouts. He squinted, as one does at a bad photocopy. The driver handed over a small, folded envelope that vanished into the gatekeeper's pocket like a secret. "Room 9?" I asked, because my curiosity now had the acceleration of a bad habit. The gatekeeper's eyes flicked up to mine like a predator checking prey, and then away. "In the back," he said, voice gravel rough. "Night shift." The driver exhaled and locked the steering wheel. He turned to me then with a face that had been reset to neutral. "You can get out here," he said, "if you want." There is a kind of moment when doors open and choices split like a bone. The half-formed plan in my head, call someone, report, walk away, was an artful, impossible thing. I could have left. I could have taken the tag and the envelope and the metal feather and walked to the lit edges of the world where civic actors waited. I could have been the patient one who feeds curiosities into official channels. Instead, I did what I often do. I followed the curiosity that had the shape of a small animal. Leeched, yes, but alive. "How long is the shift?" I asked, more for a measure of time than an answer. "Till it's done," he said. "Come, don't be dumb." He had used the final word the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, precise. It didn't forbid me, but it held out the clear consequence of being foolish. I climbed out into the rain. The air was thinner here, or perhaps my lungs simply felt less used to it.
The gate smelled of oil and something that might have been old wax. The night smelled like other people's secrets and the rain trying to wash them clean. The man with the clipboard led us through a narrow corridor between two buildings into a service entrance. A light above the door seemed to blink once like a warning. I felt the weight of the tag in my pocket and the strange coolness of the metal feather between my fingers. I thought about the hum and the way it had matched my pulse and sometimes outrun it. I thought about the way his hands had tightened on the wheel when I asked questions. He led me down a hall where the acoustics took our steps and made them sound like elaborate events. Doorways opened onto spaces that smelled faintly of disinfectant and citrus, like staged hospitals. People in dark uniforms passed us without remark, their faces shades like phone screens. On one wall, a bulletin board was pinned with memos, typed notes, some with stamps of hours, one with an index card that read, in block capitals, "No visitors after midnight." A dozen other printed slips were marked Room 9, with arrows in shorthand.
Room 9's name met me everywhere like a rumor I had already heard. We were near the sound now. The hum was louder through the walls, an industry of small, controlled noise. It vibrated in my teeth. I told myself I would simply observe, that I would not get unreasonable. I told myself a lot of things. A door at the end of the corridor, unmarked, swinged open. It revealed a small vestibule. The hum was concentrated there and made the hair on my arms prick. A narrow window in the door had been covered with a shade. The hand on the other side of the door's knob was steady. A man in a white coat, shadowed in the doorway, asked no questions. He held a clipboard the size of an altar. "Our courier," the man at the gate said, "and a passenger, one curious." "Make a note," the white-coated man said. He did not ask me to identify myself. He did not need to. The words were efficient. The gatekeeper made the note as if he had been told to. They opened the door. The air that spilled out was colder and smelled clean and sharp, like a refrigerator in a chapel. The hum was no longer just a sound. It was a pressure, a statistical thing that availed itself of space. The door's shade was drawn against the room, and light leaked like a wound. The white-coated man pointed to a metal trolley and a smaller crate, and for a second my brain, overexposed from all its previous training, read them into familiar taxonomies. But then the trolley cast a shadow that didn't match the crate's shape. There was a neatness to everything in that room that suggested hands had practiced this performance 1,000 times. Labels were taped in tidy rows, straps coiled, and envelopes stacked like prayers. In one corner, a sealed file stamped Room 9, Confidential, sat like a book of sins. A lamp hummed. The coffin of that lamp at once made the room clinical and cinematic. "You can wait here," the man with the clipboard said. He folded his hands as if closing a book. The rain outside kept time. The hum pressed against the walls. The driver left without ceremony. There was a moment while the door closed where I felt the shape of an entire argument I could have about leaving. I didn't. A small man entered then, his shoes squeaking the way shoes do when they have been scrubbed recently. He wore gloves, not the disposable kind, but the heavier ones that engineers favor. He left the gloves on and approached the crate with the kind of attention one might give a valuable instrument. He ran a gloved finger along one seam like a man might test a piano's tuning. His expression was inscrutable, like a coin turned in light. He released the straps and then slid off the canvas with a delicacy that felt like an apology. The crate opened like someone's hushed confession. I tried to look without seeing, an odd feat of modern life, but my eyes were traitors. What I saw fits into no honest taxonomy. It suggested avian, an instrument, and flesh seam, but not in any culmination.
There were membranes that caught the lamplight and reflected like fat in a kitchen pan. There were metallic barbs like curtailed quills, and a surface that might once have been skin, but had been treated or replaced with something that shone like enamel. The thing, a wrong thing, did not struggle. It did not satisfy the horror of movement. It lay composed as if waiting to be asked what it was. The man in the gloves hummed a soft note like a reader of psalms. He lifted a small mirror and shaded the thing's surface. There was a rectangular tag pinned to the nearest area of surface that read, Specimen 9 RN. The red type bled just slightly at the edges, like money on a rainy night. Something small, like a rasp then, a sound perhaps of a strap giving, made me step back. The man in the gloves began to speak, softly, into a recorder clipped to his coat. He said words that were protocols and not answers. Temperatures, humidity, a notation that something had been stabilized. The tone of his voice was neutral, professional, and that neutrality is what made the scene brutal. It was as if a priest had explained the ritual without emotion. I stood rooted, feeling like a voyeur in a cathedral of practice. My own impulse, to record, to photograph, to take evidence, had been suppressed again, precisely because the room asked us not to be foolish here. or perhaps because the wrong thing in the crate was not something one could easily translate into the language of evidence. It was a specimen that preferred not to be known. "Why is it like that?" I asked, the question bare and small, like someone asking why the ocean is cold. The man in gloves did not look at me. "It's not for entertainment," he said. "It's for study." Study is a public word. It implies learning and perhaps redemption. But words in institutional rooms are often little more than placards. They function to soften the edge of what is done here. He lifted something from the tray of instruments, an item that looked like a probe but had edges that caught the lamplight and turned it into something ornate. He put it down, and then, without a sound, attached a small, flat sensor to the surface of the thing. A monitor on the cart chirped dimly, and then steadied. The hum harmonized with the monitor's beep, like two metronomes agreeing on a tempo. I felt my mouth tasting the word hybrid, and then I tasted it again, and then it curdled into something else. Curiosity, the old tooth, had opened and bitten down and would not release. The man in gloves turned to me at last. His eyes were not unkind. "You'll remember this," he said. "Keep what you know moderate. Keep your questions within a line. We don't like noise." "What happens if I ask?" I probed the line like a nerve. His smile was slow and not pleasant. "You will learn," he said, "or you'll learn not to." It was an answer that offered consequence and possibility both.
The car man had been at least honest about one thing. Curiosity brings people to odd places. The difference I was beginning to see is that the people who run places like Room 9 teach you that questions are not neutral. They are a currency, and also a risk. The man with the clipboard folded his hands and turned to speak to someone outside the room. Doors closed softly. The hum resumed in a low, satisfied murmur. The lamp made the specimen's surface gleam, and it gleamed like something one might keep in a glass case, pretty and wrong. I thought of leaving then, taking the tag, taking the metal feather, walking under the rain to a world of ordinary decisions. I thought of taking the receipt, the envelope, the record on my phone, something to bring to light. But I had been here too far. The night had braided itself into my choices. I had touched the cold metal feather and felt its chill settle into me like a scar. "You're staying," the man with the clipboard said, as if voicing what had been decided before I had the chance to choose. I didn't move. I couldn't tell whether that had been a comfort or a sentence. He nodded then to the man in the gloves, and the man he nodded to began to speak. They used words like queue and schedule and transfer, core vocabulary for people who perform the necessary violence of moving things so institutions may learn in private. "One more observation," the man in the glove said, and his voice made the room blear slightly around the edges. "We don't know everything about it. We know enough." He waited, as if to allow that to land. "We'd like to know more." He gestured to the specimen with a gloved hand. The lamp threw a slim spotlight across its surface, and the shadows pooled like small, honest questions. The hum winked. The monitor took a breath that matched mine for a beat, and then found its own pulse again. I had come expecting to be a passenger and nothing more. I had gotten a crate, a hum, a man who drove the margins of legality with both bluntness and care. I had gotten an envelope stamped with instructions and a tag that read Specimen 9. I had gotten a room where people rehearsed protocols around a thing that refused to be simply known. I stayed because I wanted to know what that refusal looked like when handled in daylight. I stayed because it was one of the few times in my life where the moral economy was not divided cleanly between the hero and the villain. I stayed because some part of me wanted to catalog how someone would look when the world allowed them to be a page in a hidden ledger. They asked me to remove the metal feather from my pocket. I did. It was cool and not ornamental, a precise thing, like the tip of a broken instrument. The man in gloves took it and examined it under the lamp, his magnifying glass an accusation. He set it down on a pad of paper and marked its characteristics with a pen that left small, meticulous strokes. "You should not be here," he said finally.
Everything in his voice suggested he had said that to other people before. It was a polite rebuke. It was the sort of thing a place like this had taught its attendants to say, a small, functional lie that reduced the world into manageable pieces. I had, at some point in the evening, elected to be more trouble than most, and they were obliging me the favor of telling me so. The man in gloves set the metal feather on a sterile pad and peered at it through a loop like a jeweler appraising something that might have been made in the wrong century. He made a notation on a clipboard in a slow, deliberate hand. The magnifying glass turned the feather's notches into topography. The small grooves read like the rings of a tree. When he looked up, his eyes were flat and tired in the kind of way people who have swallowed whole shifts of moral ambiguity look. "We will catalog it," he said. "It will go in inventory." Inventory, I repeated, tasting the word as if it were a coin I didn't have the right change for. "Yes," he said. "Everything has a number here. It helps things remain quiet." They let me stay because it was easier than expelling me. Expulsion creates paperwork and complications. In the arithmetic of institutions, a witness who could be gently instructed to forget is cheaper than a confrontation. The man with the clipboard explained the layout of their argument the way a docent explains a painting, detached. Room 9 handled atypical biological material. They used clinical tradecraft to frame the monstrous as ordinary. Stabilize, monitor, archive, transfer. The words provided a varnish. They offered me a chair. It was the small blue plastic sort hospitals use in waiting rooms and at emergency department triage. It made the kind of sound chairs make when they are sat upon by people who have accepted being somewhere they shouldn't be. I sat. The hum was in the walls now, a low, companionable thing that made the fluorescent lights vibrate in sympathy. I put my hands in my lap and tried to do the sensible thing, observe and not be observed. The man in gloves returned to his instruments and began a liturgy. He lifted instruments with gloved care and arranged them as if preparing for an opera rather than a procedure. Each instrument had a name, each action a protocol. He clipped a small sensor to a lead, set it near the specimen surface, and watched the monitor with the concentration of someone reading a familiar page. The monitor spat out small, regular numbers and a line that wavered like a conversation. The hum under the lamp synchronized with the monitor's ticks and made the air in the room feel as if it were the inside of a machine. I had rehearsed a dozen justifications for why my presence could be tolerated. I am trained to look. That training is not a moral suit. It's a habit. It creaks.
It stands up when asked and shows you the stains. The people working here treated it like a commodity. They would tell me what they wanted me to know, controlled quantities of revelation, and no more. "You asked questions in the car," the man in the white coat said suddenly, as if reminding me of the bargain. "You saw the tag. That complicates the courier's liability. We prefer things to stay tidy." "Are they dangerous?" I asked. The question was a child's question dressed in an adult voice. He considered the form of the question and answered in the patient dialect of professionals who have learned not to make moral statements in public. "Danger is a spectrum," he said. "Potentiality does not always equal event. We temper, we measure, we learn to predict." "Predict what?" I pressed, because there is a point at which curiosity is no longer charming and becomes oppressive. He hesitated, and something like pity flipped across his face for a half-beat. "We predict behaviors," he said. "We map tendencies. We note divergence." He said it as if naming unremarkable task forces, weather forecasters noting a storm. They switched on a larger lamp, and the specimen's surface glinted like a metal artifact that had been asked to pretend at being organic. The man in gloves moved with the kind of reverence people reserve for sacred instruments. He traced a gloved finger along seams and shaded sections with a small mirror to examine subsurface layering. There were surfaces that reflected light like enamel, ridges that looked engineered, places where tissue, if tissue it was, looked to have been reinforced with something cold and man-made. The more I looked, the less sure I was of any taxonomy. Bird was the closest word my memory offered. Machine and skin and fin and scale struggled for purchase after it. The small monitor chirped and drew my attention to a faint, irregular suggestion of movement beneath an area of overlapping plates. It was not the sort of living movement that would convince an animal lover, no frantic thrashing, no open-eyed panic. It was more like a sigh, a localized flex, a small displacement of material that suggested internal pressure. The man in gloves watched the monitor like a man watching a slow heartbeat on a broken clock. "It responds to touch," he said, lightly, "in tonal increments." Tonal increments? The phrase was theatrical, and I knew it, but I was listening because one of the quirks of being trained to notice is that strange language often precedes strange facts. He tapped the datapad at his elbow and pulled up a graph. Lines rose and fell with a slowness that made time feel viscous.
We stimulate, he said. We measure conductivity across the surface. We note the way it repatterns. It is not purely electric. It is mechanical too. Vibration elicits movement. My hands tightened in my lap. That was intimacy. Vibration as a language.
The hum in the walls, the rhythm in the trunk, the soft thud under the car's floorboard had not been accidents. They had been signatures. "Who funds this?" I asked. It was a blunt question, less naive than necessary. "Benefactors," the white-coated man repeated, the word like a talisman they all pretended was not corrosive. "Private donors with particular interests. They insist on discretion. They give access. They ask for results." "Results like what?" I asked. I felt like a child peering over a fence and finding the ground had been paved in secrets. "That is not for the passenger to know," the man replied, and there was a kindness in his refusal, an old institutional kindness that functioned to blunt curiosity. He smiled in an exhausted way. "We're studying integration. We test interface. We observe competency." Integration, interface, competency. The vocabulary of people refitting nature into their instruments. He turned to me then, and his glance was less an invitation than a challenge. "You can stay and watch in an observational capacity," he said. "You will not be allowed to record. You will sign acknowledgement." The tone suggested the ledger was what mattered. Paper turns curiosity into custody. I hesitated, because there are lines you step over and lines you step around. Signing makes a thing official. It is ritual. It is the moment a witness becomes a paper record. For a second, I thought of the envelope the driver had given me, and how that same logic had been applied in the car. Make a record small enough to fit a pocket. Make a proof that can be disposed of. All of the choices were crooked. To walk away was to hand the world whatever it wanted to keep secret to keep. To stay was to accept gratitude from the institution in the shape of a thin legal acknowledgement. I signed, because curiosity is not always noble. Sometimes it's a dull coil of desire that unthreads only when given the right angle. They put me just beyond the perimeter of the work area, where I could see but not touch. The man in gloves resumed his careful choreography. Instruments were placed and then removed. He ran a slender probe along a seam, and the specimen responded with the merest tightness of plate. He noted numbers and muttered to his colleague. They worked with the unhurried efficiency of people who have been repeating a ritual for a long time, and because they'd performed it many times, they were practiced in domestication, making the strange sit for examination. At one point, a young technician wheeled in a small speaker and placed it near the specimen. He spoke in a voice that was unamplified and then played tones, sine waves, frequencies approximating old bird calls, the low drones of appliances. The specimen's plates shivered like a curtain in a draft, and the monitor registered a modest spike. The man in gloves smiled with a clinical delight. "It prefers lower harmonic ranges," he said. "Subsonic stimuli provoke more robust responses." "It is more conversational than reactive." The language of conversation bothered me. Conversation presumes two agents with some degree of overlap. If this thing conversed in vibrations, what kind of interlocutor did it imagine? A device? The benefactors? Its own kind in some unknown locale? I felt an absurd, childish urge to introduce myself. At another station, a bank of older monitors displayed thumbnails, images flattened into grids. They were records of previous specimens, a wing here, an appendage there, a careful diagram of overlap. Some frames were annotated with dates. Others had small red stamps and initials. One photograph caught my eye, a glinting object similar to the feather in my hand, laid out beside a scale. The caption read, "Specimen 3, integumental alloy, not responsive to routine sedatives." The tone was bureaucratic and therefore cruel. "You've worked on others," I said, because what seemed like a discovery felt, in the light of the wall of thumbnails, more like census-taking. "Yes," the white-coated man replied. "We have dealt with a number of atypical items. Each one teaches us something new. Patterns emerge." He folded his hands and watched a technician calibrate a device. "We're cautious about language," he added. "We prefer to let the work speak." They did not want myth-making in the room. Myth invited accountability. Data invited investors and also papers. Their world depended on both restraint and the illusion of method. It was an economy of measured compassion. Ours reduced to a courtesy of procedures. They carried out a series of benign manipulations, light stimulations, temperature modulation across a tight band, minute mechanical pressure applied with a calibrated instrument. The specimen reacted each time in small ways that were enough to qualify as response, but not enough to make anyone in the room alarmed. The man in gloves tallied results with a gravity you reserve for observatories and morgues.
Halfway through the night, the room's rhythm changed. Someone at a distant console shouted a single syllable into a phone. The hum shifted, as if startled. The man with the clipboard stiffened, and the white-coated man moved to a terminal with a speed that made discretion look like panic. I could smell a faint acrid tang of ozone, and the room's temperature seemed to drop a hair. "There's an incoming transfer," the man in gloves said. "Unscheduled." The tone suggested a complication, not catastrophe. In practice, such announcements rearranged the day's arithmetic. The white-coated man pressed keys and extracted a message that he read quickly, his lips moving. "Benefactor oversight requires presence," he said. He looked at me then, and his expression held apology. "They wish to inspect personally." "Who?" I asked. The question was useless. The faces in the room were blank with knowledge the rest of the world did not have. "Visitor," he said. "They will be here soon."
When a benefactor arrives, the decorum changes. The room straightens itself into a showroom. Instruments are dusted, edges are wiped. Things are placed in better light. The men changed a tone that had been flat into one of performance readiness. People who meet benefactors know the choreography. Be competent, be silent, present the object as little as possible, present the results as much as necessary. I felt, for reasons I could not quite parse, newly nervous. Being observed by people who had power I could not imagine felt like walking into a bank where the tellers know your debts. It was the slight, private panic that compounds the principal distress. They asked me to sign another paper, an observational form that recorded the time, my name, and a single clause that I would maintain confidentiality. There is magic in signature. It bridges the witness and the institution. It renders things tidy. I signed again, a concession that felt like bribing a conscience. The gate at the compound clicked, and a car's headlights cut through the dusk like someone clearing a throat. A sedan pulled up, and a figure stepped up. There was no theater to this. The benefactor's clothes were tasteful without ostentation, a coat that looked purchased not for warmth, but to be unremarked. He wore no emblem that would give him away. The white-coated man bowed, a small nod. The benefactor's face was older, his eyes precise. "I apologize for the interruption," the benefactor said, in a voice that was precise enough to suggest languages other than English had been consulted in its shaping. He walked with the slow certainty of someone who never needed to rush. "Procedures?" "Standard observation," the white-coated man said. "Sampling, stabilization, comparative analysis." "Good." The benefactor's gaze, when it hit the specimen, changed. He watched like a person looking at a rare instrument that knew a private melody. His interest was not academic curiosity, it was possession. He had that look collectors get when the world lends them the thing they would most like to own. He moved around the specimen with the caution of a person who is aware of the possible offense their presence might cause. He tapped the monitor with a single finger and asked a question in the tone designed to be curious but not instructive. There was a small exchange about temperature set points and a notation someone made. He asked the man in gloves if the sample showed rhythmicity outside the tested parameters. The man in gloves answered carefully, measuring his words. "Not reliably," he said, "but we have seen slight, patterned responses under low-frequency stimulation." The benefactor hummed something like approval and then turned to me. For a second, I was an object in his world, a reflection of the place's taste for witnesses. "You are the passenger," he said. "Yes." The word sat in my mouth oddly. The app's little blue icon flashed like a distant harbor in my memory.
I thought of the driver who'd given me the receipt and the tag that had fit into my palm like a scapula. "Curious," he observed. "Good. Curiosity is valuable when contained, dangerous when it leaks." The benefactor's presence smoothed the room's edges into new geometric forms, access and denial, privilege and silence. He made a small interchange with the man in gloves about whether the specimen should be transferred to a different environmental unit. They argued with a kind of polite brevity that suggested there were lines they had rehearsed in 1,000 meetings. The outcome was a plan. The specimen would be stabilized further and moved to a more secure chamber overnight. The man in gloves made notes, and someone called for a transfer trolley. "Will it be returned?" I asked before I could catch myself. My question sounded foolish in the mouth of a person who had been granted no right to the object's future. "It will be kept where it does least harm," the benefactor replied, as if the world were a room you could tuck dangerous inns away into. "If you must know, it will be moved. If not, no matter." They wrapped the parcel in the canvas, straps were reattached with practiced hands, and the trolley waited. The sequence had the quiet of a small ritual, each motion precise, each hand measured. The man in gloves traced a final finger along a seam,
and then looked up at me with an expression I had seen on a surgeon who had finished a long operation. Tired, satisfied, and a little ashamed. "Thank you for staying," he said. "You will be escorted out." I felt a mixture of relief and a small mounting anger. I wanted to take what they'd shown and put it in the world with a clean line. Here it is. This is what I saw. I imagined journalists and courts and ethics panels. I imagined a long chain of genteel violence undone by transparency. The institution dealt in a different arithmetic. It neutralized curiosity by containing it and by paying people to consent. A young technician, one who had not yet learned to hide his conscience in supply drawers, handed me a small envelope. Inside was a copy of the observational form I'd signed, stamped with a time and a note. Passenger acknowledged. A polite paper to show at any inquiry, conveniently devoid of the details that made the rest of the night's activities interesting. I slipped it into my pocket as if it were a passport stamped with the body's permission. They walked me back to the gate. The driver reappeared, as if he had never left, and slid into the seat with a mechanical ease that made the car seem like a continuation of his hands. He glanced at me and then at the envelope sticking from my pocket. He muttered something. Was it apology? And started the engine. We drove away through the gravel and the rain with the same kind of silence that falls over people who've agreed they will not be let into each other's worst thoughts.
Back in the car, the tag and the feather were lighter than they had felt in the room. The driver took off his gloves and rolled them into a neat ball. He put on his ordinary face and asked if I wanted him to drop me at my place. The app's map pulsed quietly, waiting to be confirmed. The route home threaded through the city like a stitch. There were still things unresolved, but the immediate work of the world, eating, sleeping, paying bills, demanded its daily priorities. The driver drove as if his hands had not been up to their knuckles in classified things. He steered with an economy that suggested he had learned how to keep other people from asking. "I could have called someone," I said, not sure if I was rebuking him or myself. "Call who?" he asked. "Who do you call to say, 'I rode with a courier who carried a crate that might have been a bird and a machine blended together'? You call someone and they'll log a complaint, and the complaint will be a file in a drawer. Maybe it gets read, maybe it doesn't." He spoke with the cold pragmatism of people who have seen the ways institutions fold in on themselves. I had imagined reporting as an act with neat endpoints. Reality had the messy quality of smoke. He let me off at my building. The rain had slowed to a fine mist. The front steps were slick. When I turned to place the tag in my pocket, I realized my hands still smelled faintly of wax. The metal feather felt significant and idiotic all at once in my palm. I had carried it into my home like a small relic. That night, sleep did not come easily. The hum from the crate had a persistence that my mind translated into the rhythm of the city. The throb of the heating shaft beneath my apartment, the distant railway, the neighbor's refrigerator cycling. Once, in the shallow hours, I woke and for a second swore I could feel the feather's coolness against my palm, though it lay on the bedside table. The residue of wax on my finger pricked my skin like a memory. I tried to make a list of what I had gained and what I had lost. I had seen a thing arranged like a crossbreed of bird and instrument. I had evidence that a network existed, receipts, tags, a roster of room 9s. I had signed forms and collected a stamped